I folded the sweater slowly, smoothing the edges with more care than it deserved. Packing wasn't just about boxes and tape. It was about touching every memory they wanted me to abandon by Friday. My children spoke with such certainty, as if my life could be neatly packed away and hauled out with the furniture. They didn't see what I saw. The years stitched into these walls, the sacrifices no one counted but me. Tell me honestly, have you ever stood in the middle of your own home and felt like a guest, waiting for someone else to decide if you could stay? I kept my hand steady, but my mind was restless. I thought Friday would be the day my heart broke for good. Yet as I reached for a stack of old documents, something shifted. A quiet reminder whispered from the past, tucked neatly in paper and ink. By Thursday, long before their deadline, I knew I would not leave empty-handed. The sweater lay folded on the chair, but my mind refused to rest. The disruption from earlier, the reminder tucked in those papers, hovered just beneath the surface of every thought. I wanted to believe that I had time, that Friday would come and I could still decide how to face it. Yet the truth was already in motion, faster than their demands, moving me toward an outcome none of them expected. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and listened to the clock tick. The same clock had measured dinners, birthdays, late-night arguments, and quiet mornings when the world felt far away. Now it counted down to my children's deadline, the sound sharp in the silence. I poured myself tea, not because I was thirsty, but because I needed something steady to hold. Each sip carried more weight than I let show. I remembered the conversation that started it all. It wasn't loud, but it cut deep. My eldest son placed his hands flat on the table, as though pressing down the decision he had already made. "You need to be out by Friday," he said, his tone final, like the slamming of a door. His siblings nodded. Not one of them looked me in the eye long enough to see what they were doing. They framed it as concern. They said the house was too big for me, that I shouldn't carry the burden of upkeep. But their words didn't match their urgency. Their eyes shone with something closer to calculation than care. I had learned to read those eyes when they were children, trying to slip a hand into the cookie jar. Only now, the jar was a home, and the stakes were heavier than sugar. I let them speak. I let the words pile up until they believed I had no response. Inside, I carried the sound of their voices like stones, heavy, sharp-edged, impossible to ignore. They thought my silence meant surrender. They mistook quiet for weakness, forgetting how many years I had spent building a life from less than nothing. As I sat there, with the documents tucked safely in my drawer, I wondered how they would react when the truth came forward. Would they shout? Would they crumble? Or would they look at me with the same blank certainty, refusing to see what they had done? The questions circled me like shadows. I didn't have answers yet, but I knew the clock would bring them soon enough. I left the table and walked the hall. The photographs along the wall seemed to follow me, faces from years when loyalty felt unshakable. I touched the frame of a picture where all 3 children were still small, pressed against me in a park. Their smiles were genuine then. They didn't yet know how to measure love against property. They didn't yet see me as an obstacle. The hallway smelled faintly of polish and age. Every board creaked in ways I could identify blindfolded. These sounds were the voice of my life here. I wondered if they had already stopped hearing them, deaf to what the house was telling us. To them, these walls were a transaction. To me, they were testimony. In the living room, a box sat open. My daughter had begun sorting books, stacking them with a hurried impatience that told me she wasn't reading the titles. She once spent hours sprawled on this same rug with stories in her lap, her lips moving silently as she learned to string words together. Now she handled those same books as though they were in her way. I waited until she left before pulling one back out of the box. The cover was worn, the spine cracked, but inside was a message she had scrawled as a child. "For Mom, thank you for reading to me." I closed the book and slipped it into my own bag. Not out of spite, but because some things deserved to remain with me, not in a stranger's hands after the house changed ownership. Night pressed deeper against the windows. The ticking clock carried on, indifferent to my turmoil. I returned to the documents, laying them flat on the table. The signatures were my own, written years ago with careful resolve. At the time, I never imagined they would matter this much. They were meant to protect, to keep something safe for the day when I might be most vulnerable. And now, that day had arrived. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling, letting the weight of the moment settle. My children thought Friday was the end of my story. What they didn't realize was that Thursday held its own chapter, written in ink long before they decided to erase me from my own home. I exhaled slowly. The plan wasn't fully formed, but the foundation was there. For the first time since their demand, I felt the ground shift, not beneath me, but in my favor. The sweater still sat folded, the boxes still half-filled, but the silence around me carried a new note. It wasn't surrender anymore. It was the first breath of something steady, something they couldn't take. I couldn't sleep that night. The thought of those papers in my drawer kept me awake, but it wasn't fear that stirred me. It was memory. The house itself seemed to speak when the world grew quiet, drawing me from my bed and into its rooms. I walked softly, almost like a guest in a museum, though I had lived here most of my life. The first stop was the living room. The rug was worn thin in the spot where the sofa had sat for decades. I remembered my youngest taking his first steps right there, wobbling toward me with arms outstretched. The joy of that moment still lived in the fibers, though my children now wanted it erased with new paint and flooring. I stood for a while, letting the memory settle before moving on. In the kitchen, I ran my hand along the counter. The surface was scratched from years of cutting bread directly on it when money was tight, and we couldn't replace boards or buy new equipment. The sound of laughter used to fill that space. Birthday cakes, Sunday breakfasts, late-night snacks when someone couldn't sleep. My children had forgotten those details, but I couldn't. The dining room told a different story. That table had held arguments as fierce as any storm. We had fought about school, money, curfews, and choices I didn't agree with. But we also shared peace there, the kind that comes when a family eats together and for a short while sets aside differences. Looking at the empty chairs now, I wondered if they remembered those meals or only the fights. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step familiar under my weight. In the hallway, the gallery of photographs waited. Some frames were crooked, others fading, but each carried a piece of who we once were. I paused at one taken on a holiday years ago. The children grinning, their mother beside me, all of us pressed together. I felt my throat tighten. Back then, we didn't think about houses or inheritances. We thought about staying close, keeping promises. In my daughter's old room, the wallpaper still carried faint outlines where posters once hung. She had begged me not to paint over them, and I hadn't. I remembered sitting on the edge of her bed when she cried over teenage heartbreak, promising her that time would mend it. Now she packed this room into boxes without hesitation, blind to what it held. The boys' room was different. Scuffed floors, marks on the wall from when they tossed a ball indoors against my rules. I remembered pretending to be angry, then sneaking in later to laugh at the mess. Those scratches became part of the room's identity, little scars of life. I touched one of them and felt something stir inside me. An unwillingness to let others call it damage. To me, it was proof of growth. I ended in my own bedroom. The air was heavy, not with dust, but with years of mornings and nights lived inside those four walls. I opened the drawer of the nightstand and found a faded letter from my wife, written before she passed. Her words told me to hold fast to what we built, to remember that a house was more than wood and stone. She couldn't have known how much I'd need that reminder now. Every room gave me something that my children couldn't see: history, loyalty, the shape of our lives. To them, this was just property. To me, it was the map of who we were. As I walked back to the kitchen, I realized that leaving on their terms meant letting all of this vanish into someone else's story. That thought settled on me heavier than any box. But I also realized something else. The papers in my drawer weren't just protection. They were a chance to decide how this chapter ended. They believed Friday was their victory. They had no idea that Thursday was mine. The night's walk through the house stayed with me the next morning. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had already gone cold, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. The silence outside was different now, though. It carried something I hadn't noticed before, whispers. Not voices in my head, but the unmistakable sense that people beyond these walls were already speaking about me, about us, about this house. I stepped outside to fetch the newspaper, and that's when I caught the looks. Two of my neighbors, both standing at the edge of their lawns, had paused their conversation the second they saw me. Their polite nods came a fraction too late, like they'd been caught discussing something best left unsaid. I knew that look. It was the look of people who believed they knew more than they should. The house had been part of this neighborhood longer than most of its residents. I had watched roofs change, fences replaced, new cars parked where old ones had rusted. But my house stayed. And because it stayed, it became something else. A landmark, a reference point, a reminder. People told stories about us as if we were part of the foundation itself. Some stories were kind, about the cookouts we once hosted, the garden my wife had tended. Others were less flattering, spun out of misunderstandings or exaggerations. Now, with my children pushing me out, those whispers carried weight. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Khan from across the street knocked on my door. She brought a basket of fruit, the way she always did after visiting her relatives in the countryside. But this time, she lingered in the doorway, eyes flicking past me toward the boxes stacked in the hallway. "They say you're leaving," she said quietly, almost regretfully. I nodded but didn't confirm it. Let them wonder. She hesitated before adding, "Houses don't stay the same once the first family goes. They become shells. You'll miss it more than they will." Her words stayed with me long after she left. She didn't mean harm. If anything, she meant comfort. But they revealed what I already suspected. The story of this house was no longer mine alone. It had become public property in the minds of the neighbors, something for them to weigh and dissect. That evening, I stood at the front window and watched the street. Cars slowed when they passed, drivers sneaking glances. A few even parked longer than usual, as if waiting to see if something dramatic would happen. I realized then that my children's push to move me out wasn't just a family matter anymore. It was entertainment for others. The thought made my stomach tighten. Still, the whispers had an unexpected effect. Instead of weakening me, they sharpened my resolve. If the neighborhood was watching, then every move I made mattered. The papers in my drawer weren't only about protecting myself, they were about reclaiming the narrative. I wouldn't let my children or the neighbors write me as the defeated old man who got shoved aside. The following day, I decided to walk to the small store down the block. It wasn't far, but I hadn't gone in months. As I walked, I felt eyes on me from porches and windows. Some people waved, others pretended not to notice. At the shop, the clerk, who had known me for years, asked bluntly, "So is it true you're selling?" I forced a smile. People talk more than they listen. His chuckle told me everything. The whispers had spread wider than I thought. On the way back, I slowed my pace and looked at the houses lined up neatly on both sides of the street. Each had its own story, some new, some fading. I wondered how many of those families had already planned what would happen to their homes once they were gone. Or would their children, like mine, try to rush them out too? The thought was bitter but clarifying. I wasn't alone in this struggle. I was just one of the first to face it. That night, I sat again at the kitchen table. Only this time I pulled the papers out of the drawer and laid them flat before me. I read each page carefully, tracing the words with my finger, feeling the weight of what they meant. They weren't just legal protection. They were my voice on paper, louder than any whisper in the neighborhood. I thought of my wife's letter, of the rooms I had walked through, of Mrs. Khan's fruit basket, and the glances from passing cars. All of it formed a single truth. If I gave in now, I'd not only lose the house but also the respect attached to it. And once respect is gone, it doesn't return. So I made a decision. I wouldn't wait until Friday to show them the truth. I would act Thursday, before the neighbors could finish their stories, before my children believed they had won. As I folded the papers back into their envelope, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a quiet steadiness, not excitement, not anger, but certainty. Whatever the whispers outside my door said, they would soon be replaced with a different story, one I would write myself. Thursday came with an air of finality. The sun rose the same way it always did, but I noticed details I usually missed. The way the light cut across the living room floorboards, the sound of the postman's steps on the pavement, the faint rustle of leaves outside. Everything felt heightened, as though the house itself knew this was not just another day. I sat at the kitchen table with my papers sealed in their envelope, waiting. My children had promised to come in the afternoon, expecting to box up more of what they called clutter. To them, it was routine. To me, it was the moment I had been carrying in silence. When the first knock came, it wasn't my children, but a man in a neat suit. He introduced himself as a realtor, explaining that my daughter had asked him to take photographs of the house before the sale. My hands gripped the back of a chair. She hadn't even told me. She had gone ahead, certain I would bend. I invited him in without raising my voice. Let him take his pictures, I thought. He snapped the kitchen, the hallway, even the rooms upstairs where posters still left outlines on the walls. Each click of his camera felt like another attempt to erase my life, but I said nothing. I knew silence had its own power, and mine would break soon enough. By mid-afternoon, my children arrived. They moved quickly, speaking over one another, stacking boxes, making decisions without me. I watched them the way one watches a storm, chaotic, noisy, certain of its own force. Finally, when my eldest son asked me to sign yet another form, I placed the envelope on the table between us. "What's this?" he asked, owning. "Read it," I said. He hesitated, then slid the papers out. His eyes scanned the words, confusion giving way to disbelief. My other children leaned over his shoulder, their chatter falling into silence. "It's already sold?" my daughter whispered. "Closed yesterday," I replied calmly. "On my terms." The room went still. For years, they had believed they could maneuver me, that age had made me too slow to act. But they hadn't accounted for the strength that comes from being underestimated. My son's jaw tightened. "You went behind our backs." I met his stare. "No, you went behind mine. This was me taking back what you tried to steal." No one spoke for a long moment. Then my daughter, the one who had brought the realtor, shook her head. "You could have told us." "And you could have respected me," I answered. The weight of that truth hung between us. They shifted uneasily, as if realizing too late that they had lost not just a house, but a measure of my trust. I expected anger, maybe even shouting. Instead, there was something quieter, defeat. They knew the deal was closed. Their signatures weren't needed. Their plans collapsed in front of them, and the house was no longer theirs to control. We sat there, the silence broken only by the ticking of the wall clock. Finally, I stood and pushed the envelope back toward myself. "I won't be moved like a piece of furniture. This place carries my life in it, and I'll choose what happens to it. Not you, not anyone else." They didn't argue. Perhaps they realized there was no point. Perhaps deep down they saw what I had come to see. Dignity doesn't vanish with age. It sharpens when tested. As they gathered their things and left, I walked them to the door. The street outside was quiet, though I sensed eyes behind curtains. The neighbors would talk, of course. They always did. But this time the story they passed around wouldn't be about the old man pushed aside. It would be about the old man who outmaneuvered his own children. When the door closed, I leaned against it, breathing slowly. For the first time in months, the house felt lighter, not because it was free of boxes, but because I had reclaimed it. Every creak of the floorboard, every faded photo, every mark on the wall was mine again. Later that evening, I made myself tea and sat in the living room. The papers rested on the table beside me, no longer a secret but a shield that had done its work. I thought of my wife's letter, of the laughter that once filled these rooms, and I knew she would have approved. The battle wasn't about property. It was about place, memory, and respect. And though my children might never admit it, they had learned something that day. You don't measure a man by the years he carries, but by the choices he still makes. As the sky outside dimmed, I closed my eyes and let the quiet settle around me. Thursday had come and gone, and with it, I had written my ending on my own terms. Friday arrived, but it didn't carry the dread my children had promised. The day they had circled on calendars and spoken of with such authority had already lost its power. The deal was closed. The choice was mine. Yet the morning didn't feel like victory alone. It felt like the slow turning of a page I wasn't sure I wanted to finish reading. I brewed tea and carried it into the living room. The chair by the window, the one where my wife used to sit with her knitting, waited for me. I lowered myself into it and let the warmth of the cup seep into my hands. The house was quiet, but not empty. Every room still hummed with its own kind of memory, and I wondered whether reclaiming the house was enough. Perhaps the harder part was learning how to live inside it again without the weight of resentment pressing down. Later in the morning, I walked through the garden. The grass had grown uneven and weeds tugged at the edges of the path. My wife had always been the one to keep it tidy. As I stooped to pull a stray stalk, I felt her absence more keenly than before. She would have laughed at the sight of me struggling with a stubborn root, telling me I was too impatient to be a gardener, and she would have been right. For the first time in months, I didn't feel anger when I thought of my children. Instead, I felt something closer to grief. Grief that they hadn't trusted me enough to speak plainly. Grief that they had seen me as an obstacle rather than a father. The house was mine again, but the bond between us had changed, perhaps permanently. In the afternoon, I received a call. It was my eldest son. His voice, usually so sharp, carried hesitation. "We shouldn't have pushed you like that," he said. I let the silence stretch. Finally, I answered, "You wanted control. You forgot I still had a voice." "I know," he said softly. We thought we were helping." Helping. The word echoed in my head long after the call ended. Maybe they believed it. Maybe they convinced themselves that stripping me of choice was a form of kindness. I couldn't decide if that made it better or worse. That evening, I set the dinner table for one. I didn't cook anything elaborate, just bread and soup. Yet, as I sat there, I felt the strangeness of being both victor and mourner. I had won the right to my home, but the cost was measured in distance from the very people who should have stood beside me. Before bed, I returned to my wife's letter. Her handwriting, still clear despite the years, urged me to live with dignity, not bitterness. I traced the words with my finger, realizing she had given me not just comfort, but direction. The house would remain, yes, but I couldn't let its walls become barriers between myself and the rest of the world. Friday ended quietly. No confrontation, no eviction, no chaos. Just me, the house, and a resolve forming slowly in my chest. I had stood my ground. Now I would have to decide how to move forward, not as a man pushed aside, but as one still shaping his own story. Saturday morning carried a different kind of weight. Not the burden of dread, nor the hush of relief, but something new, an unfamiliar space between what had ended and what had yet to begin. I woke earlier than usual, not from worry, but from restlessness. The house was mine again, yet I felt the echo of my children's absence pressing in on the quiet. I lingered in the kitchen, making tea without rushing. The kettle hissed, and I thought about how silence can feel both comforting and accusing. I had protected my place, but what was I supposed to do with it now? My wife would have asked me to live, not just endure. Her letter had made that clear. As I carried my mug to the table, I found myself staring at the old calendar pinned to the wall. Appointments from months past still clung to its pages. Doctor visits, family dinners, reminders scribbled in her careful hand. The ink had faded, but the life it pointed to hadn't vanished. It was still here, waiting for me to step back into it. Later that morning, I walked into town. The streets felt narrower than I remembered, or maybe I was just seeing them differently after weeks of hiding and worry. People nodded in greeting, a few offered smiles, though I could feel the curiosity in their eyes. News travels fast in neighborhoods like mine. They probably knew pieces of the story, enough to whisper about. but not the truth that had unfolded behind closed doors. I stopped at the cafe near the square. It had been years since I sat at one of its tables. The waitress recognized me, her eyes widening with a mix of surprise and warmth. "Haven't seen you in a long while," she said. I ordered red coffee and a sandwich, sitting by the window as the world moved around me. Watching people talk, laugh, and argue reminded me that life was still unfolding beyond my own walls. For too long, I had allowed myself to be cornered, reduced to defending what I already had instead of reaching for something more. That afternoon, back home, I pulled open the attic door. Dust rose as I climbed the stairs. Boxes waited, some filled with my children's old school projects, others stacked with photo albums, letters, and keepsakes from years when our family had felt whole. I sat on the floor and began to sort through them slowly. Every item was a story. Some carried joy, others regret. But as I moved through them, I realized I wasn't simply reliving the past. I was reclaiming it, deciding which memories to carry forward and which to leave where they belonged. In one box, I found an old journal I had kept after retiring. Pages filled with ideas of what I wanted to do, volunteer work, travel, maybe even starting a small business. I had written those words with hope, but I had let them gather dust once grief took hold. Now, holding that book in my hands, I wondered if I had been given a second chance. As evening approached, I sat once again in the living room. The house didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. It felt like a place waiting for its owner to breathe life into it again. The thought unsettled me, but it also stirred something stronger: possibility. I realized then that dignity wasn't just about holding on to what was mine. It was about showing myself, and maybe even my children, that I could still build, still choose, still change. Protecting the house had been one fight. Living fully within it would be another. The day ended not with bitterness or regret, but with the faint outline of a plan. I didn't know what form it would take yet, but I knew one thing: I wouldn't let their betrayal define the rest of my years. My story was far from over. Sunday unfolded with a kind of stillness that made me restless. The battles of the week were behind me, but the air still carried the aftertaste of arguments left unresolved. My children hadn't called again after Friday's brief apology. The silence between us stretched, and I found myself wondering if it was distance or punishment. I didn't want the house to turn into a monument of loneliness. That morning, I pulled out the journal I had found in the attic and reread the list of things I had once promised myself I would do. Volunteering at the library, joining the community center's chess club, even taking a short trip to the mountains. The words felt like echoes of a younger man, yet I wasn't ready to dismiss them. After lunch, I decided to visit the library. It was only a short walk away, though my legs reminded me with every step that I wasn't as quick as I used to be. Inside, the smell of old books brought me back to when my children were young. I had taken them here on Saturday mornings, watching as they scattered to different shelves, each chasing their own stories. I asked the librarian about volunteering. She looked surprised, then pleased, and handed me a form. "We can always use more hands," she said. I filled it out slowly, careful with my writing, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was signing toward something rather than defending against it. On my way home, I passed by the square where families gathered. I saw fathers chasing toddlers, mothers balancing bags while talking to neighbors, older men playing cards at a small table. It reminded me of what I had nearly lost by letting fear and anger lock me inside. That evening, my daughter called. Her tone was less combative than before, though the edge hadn't disappeared. "Dad, are you really planning to live there alone?" she asked. "Yes," I answered, "and I'm planning to let V, not just stay." She sighed. "We just worry about you." "I know," I said, "but worry doesn't give you the right to make my choices for me." There was silence on her end, the kind that tells you the words landed but haven't been accepted. "Maybe we can come by next week," she finally said. I agreed, though I wasn't sure what that visit would bring, reconciliation or another round of pressure. Still, it felt like a crack in the wall between us, a space where conversation might take root. Before bed, I sat by the window with the journal in my lap. I wasn't naive enough to think that a few decisions would erase years of disappointment or heal broken trust, but I knew this much. The fight for my home had awakened something I thought was gone. I still had days worth filling, choices worth making, and perhaps even bridges worth mending. Sunday ended with the faintest trace of anticipation. Not fear of what my children would demand, not sorrow for what had been lost, but the possibility that I might begin shaping life on my own terms again. The week crept forward with a quiet tension. I tried to keep myself occupied, sorting through boxes, writing small notes in my journal, and reading the library pamphlets about volunteer schedules. But the looming thought of my children's visit hung in the background. It wasn't dread exactly, more a weight I couldn't set down. When Friday evening came, I prepared the living room as if expecting company I wasn't sure would stay long. I moved the cluttered stacks of papers off the table, wiped down the chairs, and brewed tea in advance. I wanted no reason for them to look around and say I wasn't capable of managing on my own. They arrived together, a rare occurrence in itself. My son walked in first, his steps carrying an authority that wasn't earned in this house. My daughter followed, her expression carefully neutral, though her eyes scanned the room as if cataloging every detail. We exchanged greetings, the kind that sound polite but lack warmth. They sat, and for a moment the air thickened with silence. Finally, my son leaned forward. "Dad, we just want to talk." I nodded, waiting. "We don't understand why you're being so stubborn," he continued. "The villa could be sold for a good price. You'd have more money, and we'd make sure you were comfortable." Comfortable. The word stung. I had been comfortable once, but what they wanted was not about me. I could see it in the way their voices tightened, in the way they avoided looking directly at me. My daughter tried a softer approach. "We're not saying you can't live here, Dad, but wouldn't it be better to move somewhere smaller, easier to manage? We could handle the sale, deal with the agents." I listened, letting them spill their arguments. Each word revealed more than they meant to. Worry wrapped around convenience, concern mixed with self-interest. When they finished, I set down my teacup. "This house is not a burden to me. It's my anchor. You call it stubbornness, but it's simply me choosing not to erase my own life because it no longer fits your plans." My son frowned. "That's not fair." "Fair," I said, "is me not waking up to find decisions made over my head. Fair is being asked, not managed. Fair is respect." The silence that followed was sharper than any argument. My daughter shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening around her mug. "We just thought—" "I know what you thought," I interrupted gently. "But you never asked what I wanted. You assumed." There was no shouting, no slammed doors, just the raw space of truth settling between us. For the first time, I saw in their faces something other than impatience. It was discomfort, yes, but also the first hint of recognition that I wasn't surrendering. They stayed for dinner, though the conversation never drifted far from safe topics: the weather, neighborhood gossip, the grandchildren's school projects. The heavy mat of the house lingered unsaid, but it was there, like a shadow in the corner. When they finally left, my daughter lingered at the doorway. "We'll call you," she said softly. I nodded, unsure if that promise was a warning or an olive branch. After they drove away, I sat alone in the quiet, but the silence didn't feel as heavy as before. It carried a new quality, something closer to resolve than loneliness. That night, I opened my journal again. I wrote not only about the conversation, but also about what lay ahead. The chess club met on Tuesday. The library had confirmed my volunteering slot for Thursday afternoons. Life was stretching out in front of me, not waiting for permission. I realized then that my children's visit had not unsettled me as much as I feared. Instead, it had drawn a clear line. I was not helpless. I was not finished. And though the battles with them might continue, I had taken back the authority over my own choices. For the first time in years, I looked forward to the week ahead not with dread but with anticipation. Not because everything was solved, but because I knew where I stood. The following week began with a sense of balance I hadn't felt in months. My routines were slowly reshaping themselves. Morning walks, afternoons with books, evenings spent writing in my journal. Still, the uneasy truth was that peace rarely lasted long in my household. The phone rang on Tuesday, breaking into the stillness. It was my son, his tone clipped. "Dad, we need to discuss the paperwork." I asked what paperwork he meant, though I already feared the answer. He hesitated, then said, "The deed to the villa. We found out it hasn't been updated since Mom passed. Legally, there could be complications if something happens to you. It's not safe to leave things unsettled." I heard the concern under his words, but I also heard the opportunity he was circling. Paperwork. Once signed, it could change hands quickly. "Nothing is unsettled," I told him firmly. "This house is mine, and it will remain mine until I say otherwise." The line was quiet for a moment.
Then he said, "We'll talk when I come by this weekend." He hung up before I could answer. That call set the tone for the week. My chest carried a tightness I couldn't shake, a warning of battles ahead. Still, I forced myself not to fold inward. On Thursday, I kept my promise to the library. I shelved books with other volunteers, each of us moving carefully in the quiet aisles. A woman named Layla, perhaps a few years younger than me, asked how long I'd been living in the area. We talked for nearly an hour, sharing stories of families, losses, and small victories. For the first time in years, I laughed with someone outside my family. That laughter made the weekend storm even harder. On Saturday afternoon, my children arrived again. They brought a folder this time, thick with documents. My son placed it on the table as if it were an offering, but his eyes gave away the push behind it. "Dad, this is just practical. We need your signature to update things. It protects everyone." My daughter added, "We're not trying to pressure you, but imagine if you got sick. Courts, lawyers, it would be a mess." I flipped through the pages, slow and deliberate. My late wife's name stared back at me, printed in neat legal lines. My own was there too, frozen in ink from years ago. I set the folder down. "You came here not to protect me," I said quietly, "but to protect yourselves. If you cared about me, you'd ask what I want instead of assuming I should make things easier for you." My son's face tightened. "That's unfair." I leaned back. "No. What's unfair is asking me to erase myself while I'm still alive. What's unfair is turning my home into a transaction." The air thickened. My daughter's eyes welled slightly, though she blinked hard, refusing to let them fall. My son tapped the table, restless. "You're being impossible." "I'm being clear," I answered. They gathered their things soon after. Leah banged the folder behind as if hoping I'd change my mind in their absence. When the door closed, I felt the familiar sting of being alone. But this time, it was steadier. Their departure wasn't victory or loss. It was another marker on the road I had chosen. That night, I placed the folder in a drawer. I wasn't naive. Papers had power, but so did my refusal. I had learned that in battles unspoken and spoken alike. Later, sitting by the window, I realized something deeper. The struggle wasn't only about property or control. It was about dignity, the right to live without being managed like an object. My children couldn't see that yet, but perhaps one day they would. Until then, I had to hold the line. Sunday morning, I walked to the square again. The chess players waved me over. I sat, took the black pieces, and played a careful game. Each move reminded me of something I had nearly forgotten. The future wasn't just about survival. It was about playing my own strategy, not theirs. The folder stayed in my drawer all week, heavy not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. I went about my days, helping at the library, walking to the square, brewing my evening tea, but the thought of those papers waiting in the dark pressed on me. It was as though the silence of the house had gained a new voice, one that whispered, "They'll be back." They didn't wait long. On Wednesday, my daughter called. Her tone carried less sharpness than usual, but it was no less determined. "Dad, you've had time to think. Please don't drag this out. It's better if we handle it before lawyers get involved." The mention of lawyers pricked my ears. That word was no slip. It was a message, clear and deliberate. "Thank you for the warning. I said evenly. But the house is mine. No lawyer needs to tell me what I already know. She sighed, soft but pointed, and ended the call. That night I found myself pulling the folder from the drawer and laying the papers across the table.
The signatures, the clauses, the little traps written in language meant to look official, it was all there. And though I wasn't a lawyer, I had lived long enough to read between lines. By Friday, my decision was made. I walked to a small office 3 streets away, the kind of place most people ignored until they needed documents notarized or disputes handled. The lawyer was a man in his 60s, silver hair, square glasses, a firm handshake. "What brings you in?" he asked as I slid the folder onto his desk. "My children want me to sign this. I need to know what it means if I do." He leafed through the pages, his brow tightening. "If you sign, you transfer authority over this property. You wouldn't lose the right to live here immediately, but you'd no longer control what happens if they decide to sell or borrow against it. You'd essentially be giving them the steering wheel. And if I don't sign, then nothing changes. It remains yours." The simplicity of his words steadied me. I thanked him, paid the small fee for his time, and walked home with the clarity I needed. When Saturday came, they arrived together again. My son didn't waste time. "Did you look at the documents?" "Yes," I said. "I even had a lawyer review them." His eyes narrowed. And I won't be signing. The papers would strip me of the right to decide for myself. That's not protection, it's surrender. And I won't surrender. My daughter spoke quickly, almost pleading. "Dad, that's not how we meant it. We just want things to be clear." "Things are clear," I said. "They've never been clearer. I live here. This is my home. And I'll decide when or if that changes." The words settled like stones in the room. My son rubbed his forehead, frustrated. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "Hard for whom?" I asked. "Because it's not hard for me. It's simple." For once, neither of them had a reply. They exchanged a low "Okay," one of those wordless conversations siblings can have. Then my son stood. "Fine. But don't say we didn't try to make it easier." They left without tea, without lingering. The silence after the door closed was different this time. Not lighter, not heavier, simply final, at least for now. That evening, I walked to the square earlier than usual. The chess players were mid-game, but they waved me over to watch. One of them, a wiry man with sharp eyes, leaned toward me and said, "You've got the look of someone who just played a hard round off the board." He was right. And yet, sitting there among strangers who felt less like strangers each week, I realized I wasn't just resisting, I was building something new. Independence wasn't only about saying no, it was about saying yes to the life that still stretched ahead. Back home, I put the folder back into the drawer. Not as a burden this time, but as a record. Proof that I had been tested, and that I had chosen to remain standing on my own ground. The weekend passed, and for the first time in months, no one knocked on my door. I should have felt relief, but instead I sensed a pause, like the silence between storms. Families don't give up easily when they've convinced themselves their cause is noble. On Tuesday, the phone rang again. This time it wasn't my children, it was a voice I didn't recognize. The caller introduced himself as a representative from a legal office, saying my son had reached out. The words, "potential guardianship petition," came up, careful but cutting. That I let him finish, thanked him, and hung up. My chest was tight, but my mind was strangely clear. The threat wasn't subtle anymore. If they couldn't win my agreement, they might try to take control by force of law. That evening, I sat in my kitchen and wrote in my journal, something I hadn't done regularly since my wife died. I wrote not just about what had happened, but about what I feared could happen next. Would they try to paint me as incapable, as someone who couldn't manage his own affairs? I wrote down dates, conversations, names, small pieces of evidence, but mine to keep. By Thursday, I had made an appointment with the lawyer again. He listened carefully as I told him about the call. They could try it, he admitted. But guardianship requires evidence that you're unfit to make decisions. You're far from that. Still, it would be wise to prepare. Keep records, keep your finances orderly, and if you can, find people outside your family who can attest to your clarity. I left his office with two things, a packet of advice in my hand, and a new sense of urgency in my chest. Independence wasn't just about saying no anymore. It was about proving, every day, that I still stood steady on my own feet. That proof began in the smallest places. At the library, I took on more hours, helping not just with shelving but with organizing community events. People saw me there, working, contributing. At the square, I joined a tournament game instead of only watching. I lost the first round, but no one laughed. They shook my hand and called me part of the group. Each small act mattered. It was evidence of a life still being lived, not one winding down. On Sunday, I invited Layla over for tea. She had become a friend quickly, the kind of person who listened without judgment. We sat in the garden behind the villa, steam rising from our cups. Your children don't understand, she said after I explained. They see security in control. But you see security in freedom. That difference is not small. Her words landed with weight. I realized she wasn't just sympathizing, she was naming the heart of it. Later that week, my daughter came alone. She stood at the door longer than usual before knocking. When I let her in, he looked tired, her shoulders lowered. Dad, she began, I didn't know my brother called a lawyer. That wasn't me. I don't want this to become a battle. I studied her face. There was sincerity there, mixed with worry. Then why didn't you stop him? I tried, she admitted. But he thinks you're being reckless. He thinks if he doesn't act, something bad will happen down the line. I poured her a cup of tea. We sat across from each other, not as father and child at that moment, but as two adults on different sides of a line neither wanted to cross. Do you believe I can take care of myself? I asked. She hesitated, then nodded. Yes. I do. I just wish things didn't feel so fragile. Fragile. That word clung to me after she left. Because she was right in one way, life at my age carried its risks. But wasn't that true at every stage? Fragility was part of being alive. And to me, it was no excuse for giving up control. That night, I locked the folder in a drawer and tucked the key into my pocket. A symbolic act, perhaps, but it steadied me. I couldn't control what my children might attempt next. But I could control how I lived, how I showed up in the world, how I made it impossible to claim I was anything less than capable. As I lay in bed, I thought of the question I had asked myself weeks earlier. What do I have left that is mine? Now I knew the answer. My decisions, my dignity, my right to define the last chapters of my story, those were mine, and I would guard them as fiercely as any possession. That evening, I sat with the phone still warm in my hand, staring at the floor. The silence in the house no longer felt like peace. It felt like waiting. Guardianship, that word carried weight. It wasn't just about property now. It was about me, my ability to decide, my freedom. I brewed tea without tasting it, my thoughts looping. If they truly went forward with this, it wouldn't be UT persuasion anymore.
It would become a battle in a courtroom, with strangers deciding if I was capable of running my own life. The image sat in my chest like a stone. I didn't want to live in fear, so the next morning I walked to the lawyer's office again. He looked up from his desk, surprised to see me back so soon. They've escalated, I told him. I got a call last night, guardianship. He nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting the word. It's not uncommon. Children sometimes believe they're protecting a parent, but the law requires proof. A judge doesn't strip someone's independence lightly. What kind of proof? Medical evaluations, testimony about your daily life, evidence of decline. Unless you give them ammunition, it's not easy for them to succeed. I felt my shoulders lower slightly. So what do I do? He leaned back. Live your life, visibly. Keep records. Show that you manage your bills, cook your meals, handle your appointments. If it comes to court, the question will be whether you can demonstrate self-sufficiency. Walking home, I thought about what he said. It wasn't enough to know I was capable. I had to prove it, to others, to the system, maybe even to my children. That night, I pulled out my checkbook and went over the last few months of payments, making sure everything was in order. I organized my receipts in neat folders, labeled by month. I set reminders on my calendar for every upcoming bill. I wasn't preparing for battle so much as drawing a map of my daily life, one that showed I still knew where I was going. Days turned into a rhythm. I went to the library, helped at the chess tables, cooked for myself, and kept my records updated. But beneath the routine was a quiet vigilance, the sense that someone might be watching for mistakes. I didn't like it, but I also refused to give them an opening. One afternoon, while shelving books at the library, I caught sight of my daughter, standing by the entrance. She looked out of place, her arms crossed, her eyes scanning until they landed on me. "Dad, can we talk?" she asked softly. We stepped outside. The air was crisp, the kind that carries every word further than you intend. "They said you hired a lawyer," she began. "I did," I answered, "and it was the right choice." She bit her lip. "We're not trying to hurt you." "You're trying to take control," I said, my voice steady. "That's not the same thing." Her eyes filled, but she didn't look away. "I just don't want to get a call one day saying you fell or forgot something important." "I understand the fear," I said. "But fear doesn't give you the right to take over my life. You raised children of your own. You know how it feels to fight to be heard. I won't stop fighting for that same right." She didn't argue. Instead, she nodded almost to herself and walked away without another word. That evening I sat with the folder again, but this time I didn't see it as a threat. I saw it as armor. Every receipt, every record, every page was proof, not just to a judge or to my children, but to myself. The following week brought another letter, this one formal from the court. A petition had indeed been filed. My son's name was listed. My hearing date was scheduled. I held the paper for a long while, then set it down. Strangely, I felt calm. The waiting was over. Now it would be clear, one way or another. The night before the hearing, I wrote in my journal, not because anyone would read it, but because I wanted my thoughts preserved in my own words. I wrote about the walks to the square, about the smell of fresh bread from the bakery, about the quiet strength of choosing for myself every single day. These things might seem small to others, but they were the fabric of my independence. The morning came, and I dressed carefully, clean shirt, pressed trousers, polished shoes. I looked in the mirror, not searching for youth or strength, but for certainty. It was there. At the courthouse, my lawyer met me at the steps. He gave a reassuring nod. "Just tell the truth. That's all you need." Inside, the room was colder than I expected. My son sat on the other side, his jaw set, papers stacked neatly before him. My daughter sat behind him, eyes down, hands folded. When the judge entered, everyone rose. My heart beat steady, not fast. I knew who I was. They spoke first, their lawyer outlining concerns, age, isolation, potential risk. Words like safety and stability were repeated, dressed as kindness but weighted with control. Then it was my turn. I stood, my voice clear. I explained my daily life, how I managed my bills, cooked, and stayed involved in the community. I handed over the folders of receipts, calendars, and notes. I didn't argue with their fears. I simply showed my truth. When I finished, the judge leaned forward. "You've been thorough. Thank you." The decision didn't come immediately, but I walked out knowing I had spoken for myself. Whatever the outcome, I hadn't surrendered my voice. That night I sat by the window with a cup of tea watching the city lights flicker. The future wasn't certain, but neither was it stolen. For as long as I had breath, my choices would be mine to make. The judge's words echoed in my head long after the courtroom had emptied. No ruling had been handed down yet, but I had done what I came to do, stand and speak for myself. Still, the silence that followed me home felt heavier than any verdict. It was as if the whole city held its breath, waiting to see whether I would be allowed to remain the author of my own life. That night, I couldn't sleep. I replayed every sentence I had spoken, every glance my children had exchanged. I wondered if they realized what this fight had cost us already. I wondered if they cared. The next morning, I went to the square earlier than usual. The chess players were still setting up, the boards half ready, pieces clattering softly as they were placed. I sat on the bench, letting the cool air settle me. One of the regulars, a man named Rafik, approached and gave me a nod. "You're quieter today," he said. "Court," I answered simply. He gave a low whistle. "Family matters?" "Yes," I said, not offering more. He didn't press. Instead, he gestured to the board. We played, and for those few minutes, I forgot the petition, the papers, the arguments. It was just strategy, choices, consequences. When I lost, I felt a strange relief. Losing a game didn't mean losing myself. Later that afternoon, a letter arrived. This time, it wasn't from the court. It was from my daughter. Her handwriting hadn't changed since school days, looping and deliberate. Inside was a single page. She wrote that she never wanted things to come to this, that she wished we could sit at the same table without lawyers, that maybe after the hearing we could still find a way back. I read it 3 times. The words weren't an apology, not really, but they weren't an attack either. They were something in between, an acknowledgement that the ground beneath us was shaking, and she didn't know how to steady it. That evening I wrote a reply. I told her I loved her, that I understood her fear, but that I could not surrender the right to decide my own path. I slipped the letter into an envelope and walked it to the postbox myself. Days stretched into a week. The waiting gnawed at me, but I filled the time deliberately, cooking, reading, walking, writing in my journal. Each act was proof, not just for the court, but for myself. One night, while slicing vegetables, I caught myself pausing, the knife hovering above the cutting board. A thought had landed with the weight of truth. This wasn't only about them trying to take control. It was also about me proving to myself that I could stand firm even when those closest to me doubted me. The hearing reconvened on a gray morning. Rain pattered against the courthouse windows as I entered. My son was already there, papers lined up again, but he avoided my eyes this time. My daughter sat further back, her letter tucked somewhere in her bag, I imagined. When the judge returned, the room seemed smaller, tighter. He spoke carefully, acknowledging the petition, the evidence, my response. Then he said something that struck me deeply. The court must balance protection with respect for autonomy. He turned toward me. Your records are clear. Your testimony was steady. At this time, guardianship is not granted. I let the words settle. Not granted. My independence intact. For now. My children didn't look at me as we filed out. Outside, the rain had stopped, the street wet and shining. I walked slowly, breathing in the damp air, feeling each step as a statement. I was still here, still choosing, still mine. But I also knew this wasn't an ending. Battles in families rarely end cleanly. They simmer, return, shift forms. As I unlocked my door and stepped back into my home, I told myself I had to prepare not just for another petition or another call, but for the quiet distance that might settle between us from now on. That night, I sat by the window with my journal. I wrote not only about the hearing, but about the cost of winning. Independence preserved, yes, but at what price to the bond between parent and child? Could that bond be repaired, or had it cracked beyond mending? I didn't have an answer, but for the first time in weeks, I slept soundly. After the ruling, a strange silence settled in the house. Winning should have brought relief, but instead it left a hollowness I didn't expect. Independence was mine, yes, but the absence of calls from my children grew louder with each passing day. Even the little arguments, the clipped exchanges over groceries or bills had vanished. In their place was nothing. That emptiness followed me into my routines. At the chess square, I moved pieces with more care than usual, dragging games out, not eager to return to a quiet apartment. Neighbors asked how I was, and I gave polite answers, the kind that ended conversations quickly. I could see in their eyes they wanted to ask more, but most people hesitate when family matters are involved. They sense the fracture but don't want to step into it. One evening, as I prepared tea, the phone rang. My heart jolted, half hoping it was one of them, half fearing it was. But it was a distant cousin instead, someone I hadn't spoken to in months. She had heard rumors, always the whispers that travel faster than facts, and she wanted to know if it was true. I confirmed only the basics. Yes, there had been a petition. Yes, the court decided against it. No, things were not mended. She sighed on the other end, then told me something that struck harder than she knew. They must be desperate to take such steps, but desperation often hides guilt. Her words stayed with me. Was guilt part of this? Were my children masking regret with control? Or was it simply fear, the fear that comes when roles reverse and a parent begins to look fragile in their eyes? That night, I thought about writing to them again. Not another defense, not another reminder of my capacity, but a plain letter about memory. I wanted to tell them about the days when they were small, about mornings filled with spilled cereal and misplaced shoes, about how fiercely I had worked to keep the lights on and their futures bright. Maybe if I reminded them of those moments, they would remember I was never their opponent, only their parent. I wrote a draft but didn't send it. Something in me hesitated. Perhaps I was afraid it would be ignored or worse, met with silence again. The following week, I ran into my daughter outside a grocery store. We both froze, hands clutching bags of produce, neither sure how to start. Finally, she asked, "Are you managing okay?" "I am," I said, steady but not sharp. "I've been managing for a long time." She nodded, but her eyes dropped to the ground. I wanted to ask her why the petition, why the distance, but the parking lot didn't feel like the place for truth. Instead, I asked if she wanted to walk with me. To my surprise, she agreed. We walked slowly, carrying our groceries side by side. She spoke about her children, their schools, the busyness of her days. Ordinary details, but laced with something deeper. When she paused, I asked softly, "Did you think I couldn't keep up anymore?" She stopped, shifting her bag from one hand to the other. "We were scared," she admitted. "Not of you failing, but of us not being there when you needed someone. We thought maybe it was safer to take the choice away before something happened." Her honesty cut me open. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was an answer. I told her I'd rather stumble on my own than be carried before I was ready. She looked at me then, really looked, and I saw the battle in her eyes. Love tangled with fear, respect colliding with worry. We parted without resolution, but the fact that we walked together at all felt like a thread stitched back into place. Fragile, yes, but a start. Back home, I placed the unsent letter in a drawer. Maybe one day I'd send it, maybe not. For now, I understood something new. The court had affirmed my independence, but no ruling could restore what was broken between us. That work would take time, patience, and perhaps more courage than the legal fight itself. Before sleeping, I wrote one line in my journal: "Winning is not the same as healing." And for the first time since the hearing, I let myself believe that both might still be possible. The week after my unexpected encounter with my Dawit, I found myself replaying her words again and again. Fear had driven them, not hatred. That distinction mattered more than I wanted to admit. It didn't excuse the betrayal, but it softened the sharp edge I had carried in my chest since the petition. Still, fear doesn't vanish overnight, and neither does hurt. I began noticing the way absence had reshaped my days. The silences that once felt like punishment now had a texture of their own. I filled them with long walks through the park, watching younger families spread blankets, children tumbling across grass, voices carried by wind. I couldn't help wondering if my children remembered me like that, steady hands guiding them across streets, urging them through homework, telling stories at the edge of their beds. If they did, how had those memories soured into suspicion? That question led me to a decision I hadn't expected. I would not wait for them to close the distance. I would try, even if every attempt risked another wound. The alternative was to let silence calcify into permanence. I started with my son. He lived only a short drive away, though it felt like miles of unspoken tension stretched between us. I dialed his number 3 times before I found the nerve to let the call ring. When he answered, his tone was guarded but not hostile. "I was thinking," I said slowly, "we should have dinner together. Just you and me." There was a pause, the kind that stretches into uncertainty. Then he agreed. We met at a modest restaurant near his office. The food wasn't remarkable, but the moment was. We spoke about routine things, traffic, work, the rising cost of everything. Nothing explosive, nothing raw. Yet under it all lingered the weight of what we didn't say. Finally, as the plates cleared, I asked the question that had pressed on me for weeks. "Why didn't you come to me first?" He leaned back, exhaling like he'd been waiting for it. "Because we thought you'd take it as an insult. We knew how fiercely you guard your choices. We thought if we asked, you'd push us away even further. The court seemed like the only way left." The logic didn't comfort me, but for the first time I heard the tangled knot of fear and miscalculation behind their decision. It wasn't malice, it was a failure of courage. I told him plainly, if you had come to me, even if I had been angry at first, we could have argued it through. That would have been better than what you chose. He nodded, and though he didn't say it outright, I saw recognition in his eyes. After dinner, as we stood outside, he said something small but significant. "Next time, I'll ask." It wasn't an apology in words, but it carried the weight of one. Back at home, I sat in my chair thinking about how fragile reconciliation can be. It doesn't come with fireworks or grand gestures. It comes in quiet agreements, half-spoken promises, and moments when silence holds more meaning than speech. The days that followed brought more shifts. My daughter called once, asking if I needed groceries. I declined, not out of pride, but to show her I was capable. The very next day, though, I asked if she'd like to come with me to the market. This time, she said yes. Together, we walked the aisles, debating the merits of different tea brands, the way we might have once done years ago when she was still young enough to slip treats into the cart and hope I wouldn't notice. For the first time in months, we laughed. Short, cautious laughter, but real. Still, I remained aware of the unhealed places. A court order cannot undo suspicion, and a conversation or two cannot erase the sting of being doubted by your own children. But I began to see the road back was not blocked. It was simply steep. One evening, as I wrote in my journal, I caught myself thinking less about what had been taken from me and more about what could still be repaired. That change surprised me. It didn't come from forgiveness alone, but from realizing I wanted more than to prove I was right. I wanted connection, even if it came slowly, even if it demanded I face their fear again and again. I closed the journal with one final note that night. Healing does not mean forgetting. Healing means choosing not to live only in the wound. In the end, I realized dignity isn't about winning every battle. It's about choosing not to surrender yourself, even when those closest to you misjudge your strength. My children and I may never erase the marks left behind, but we can walk forward with a clearer understanding of what fear does to families and what courage can rebuild. That's what this journey gave me. Not triumph over them, but steadiness within myself. And I'll ask you this. How many of us have carried wounds from those we love most, yet found ourselves searching for the smallest cracks of light, hoping they'd lead us back to something worth saving? That tension between pain and possibility is what keeps our hearts alive. If this story stirred something in you, there's another chapter of struggle and resilience I want you to experience. It's about what happens when the demand to leave doesn't just test a home, but tests the very meaning of belonging. You'll see how choices made under pressure can close one door by Thursday and open another you never expected. Stay with me and let the next story show you where strength can be found when the ground shifts beneath your feet.